So good morning, everyone, and a special good morning to those of you who've joined us on YouTube for our live streaming of this talk. So this week we're going to be looking at the second of the 5 ethical precepts. But before we get into that, I'd just like to briefly recap on what we covered last week when we looked at the first precept. So last week we looked at some general principles relating to Buddhist ethics. We looked at how we can see ethics not as a set of rules, but as an expression of our going for refuge or our commitment to following the Buddhist path. We can see our ethical behavior as a living out of our aspiration to attain that state of consciousness that we call enlightenment. And we looked at how the ethical precepts take many different forms. We particularly use the 5 precepts as our standard, if you like. All these different ethical forms are really just different ways of expressing the same thing. They various levels of detail. So the 5 precepts, which is quite a basic set. We have the 10 precepts, which are just an elaboration on the basic precepts. And then we can go right up to the monastic code of over 200 rules, which are really elaborations and very specific applications of the more general precepts to a monastic situation. So we have all of these different formulations of the precepts, but underneath all of that, they're really expressing the same thing. That the ethical precepts are really a way of describing how an enlightened being would spontaneously behave in the world. That's just simply how an enlightened being is. Of course, for us as yet, well, most of us maybe, I'm certainly speaking for myself here, us as yet unenlightened beings, our ethical behavior doesn't always happen spontaneously, but we have to work at it. And that's why the form that the precepts take is that of training principles. When we're looking at ethics, we're not looking at necessarily things being right or wrong or good or bad, but rather we use the terms skillful and unskillful. And our ethical training is to try and move away from unskillful behaviors and towards more skillful behaviors. There's another general point which we didn't touch on last week, but I'd like to add before we get into this week's, and that is that acting skillfully, acting in accordance with the precepts, begins with the mind. Perhaps if I can ask my technical assistants to jump to the 3rd slide, we can see that. So if we take the first precept as an example of this, we can only act with loving kindness if we think in a loving and kindly way. We cannot act with love if our mind is full of anger and full of ill will. And similarly, when we come to the 2nd precept, so if we could just have the slide for the 2nd precept back. When we come to the 2nd precept, which is all about generosity, we can see that we're trying to move away from behavior, which we call taking the not given, and moving towards behavior of generosity. And likewise, that starts with the mind, that if we're craving other people's things in our mind, if we want what someone else has, then it's going to be very difficult to behave in a generous way. We're more likely to behave in a way of selfishness, of taking what we want. So when we look at this 2nd precept, again, much as we did with the 1st precept, we shouldn't see it as limited in its scope strictly to the form of words that it uses. So yes, the 2nd precept is telling us that we need to move away from such behaviors as stealing what belongs to others. But if, for example, we're not in the habit of going around robbing a bank or holding up a jewelry shop or mugging old ladies on the street, that doesn't mean that we're doing necessarily okay. It's good that we're not doing those things, but that doesn't exhaust the second precept by any means at all. There are many, many other ways that we can take the not given apart from those glaringly obvious ones. A few examples might be, if overstating our expense claims at work, if we're claiming a mileage allowance and we say we used our car to drive 50 miles when actually we only drove 47 miles, but it seems okay to round it up. Or being a bit creative when we complete our tax returns on the basis that, well, everybody does it, so it doesn't hurt. And anyway, the taxman's money is all our money to start with. Or using our employer's stationery for our personal needs. Not returning the money when we notice that a shop assistant has given us too much change. Taking an extra 15 minutes for our lunch break, and so on. There are many things like that. You may well wonder where those examples came from, and I have to confess that I'm probably responsible for many, if not all of those at some point in my life. But it doesn't take much reflection to come up with a whole list of the many creative ways that we have of taking what's not actually being given to us, taking what someone else really didn't want us to have, but we find ways of getting it for ourselves. There are also ways that we may not recognize as being taking the not given. For example, taking up someone's time without considering if they really want to give us that time. When someone that we meet casually asks us, "Oh, hello, how are you? Not seen you for a while." Generally, that's an invitation to give a fairly short answer. And if we just then launch into an in-depth explanation of everything that's gone wrong in our lives over the past 6 months, we're probably taking more of their time and their emotional energy than they really wanted to give us. But through our own lack of awareness of what's going on, we just, as it were, take what we feel we need without any regard for what the other person may need. Of course, they may be perfectly willing to stand and listen to us recount every minor detail of our life, but we can't necessarily make that assumption. We can often take the not given through manipulation and coercion by making sure that we get what we want through various devious means. And also perhaps by denying someone the opportunity to do what they want to do, by just assuming that people will do what we want to do, and not even really bothering to ask whether that's the case. There are many, many ways of taking the not given, and we can be very, very creative in doing that and in justifying it to ourselves, of course. Not that those justifications hold much water, but we're good at providing justifications for all of our little habits. And the more we think about it, the longer the list grows. As a general guide, we could say that whenever we're behaving out of self-interest, we're probably taking the not given in some way or another. Certainly, whenever we're being selfish, then someone else is suffering as a result of that selfishness on our part. And of course, behaving selfishly is not expressing our commitment to follow the Buddha's path to enlightenment. It's not an expression of our going for refuge. It's unskillful behavior from that point of view. So if we could just go back to the second precept slide again, please. Thank you. So the positive side of this precept is with open-handed generosity. I purify my body. You may remember from last week, I spoke about how all of these precepts have a negative and a positive aspect. The negative aspect is that which we're trying to move away from. and the positive aspect is that which we're trying to move towards. And this gives us our sense of it, ethical behavior being a training, being something that we practice, that we get better at, that we become more skillful, to use our terminology. We move away from the unskillful behavior and towards the skillful behavior. So the positive side of this precept encourages us to act with generosity, with open-handed generosity, as it puts it, with unlimited generosity. So important is generosity on the Buddha's path that the Buddha would often start a discourse by telling his listeners that the path starts with generosity. He would separate generosity out from other ethical practices and put it right at the front. Because that's something that we can all do. You know, we may not have the best conditions for meditation in our life. We may not be able to study the Buddha's teachings. We may not have the time for a sustained practice of the Buddha's teachings, but we can all be generous. We all have something that we can give. But why did the Buddha place such importance on generosity? Why did the Buddha think it was so significant that he would single it out from all of the other ethical values and put it right at the front of his teaching? And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that behaving selfishly, behaving in the opposite way to generosity, behaving in a way that's taking rather than giving, is an expression of our attachment to the self. It's an expression of our attachment to ourselves as something fixed and independent in the world, and therefore something that needs protecting, something that needs satisfying, something that needs gratification, something that we need to fence off from everything that may be a threat to it, and to make sure that we get our share of everything that's going, and possibly a little bit more than our share just in case. I guess we all perhaps witnessed something of that quite recently with the run on toilet rolls from all of our supermarkets. You know, a prime example of people putting self-interest above everything else. That we feel threatened, and therefore we have to grab hold of everything that we feel we might need, even if we don't need it right now. So whilst in order to break through this wrong view of our fixed and independent self, we need the arising of insight, and that takes time and practice for most of us and doesn't happen necessarily quickly. There is something that we can all do to weaken that attachment to the sense of self, to the sense of the importance of ourself and the centrality of ourself in our lives. We can start to weaken that by focusing our attention more on the needs of others and less on our own wants and cravings. By focusing on the needs of others, it can weaken, it can sort of dilute that sense that we are the center of the universe and that we must be happy first. We've got to look after ourselves, putting number one at the front of the queue, as it were. And just looking at what the real needs of other people are, as opposed to just what we feel that we want in life. And the Buddha identified various ways that we can do this, various ways that we can be generous, various ways that we can give. The Buddhist term for this is Donna, and you'll hear Donna mentioned quite often. We place a great store on Donna because for these reasons, that Dana helps us to break down that self-centeredness. It's not just that when we make a Dana announcement, it's not just that we want your money. I mean, obviously that's very useful and necessary to us up to a point. But Dana is not just about money, as we'll see in a moment. Dana is also an opportunity for each one of us to give. It's an opportunity for each one of us to step out of ourselves and to engage more widely with the community that we're in. It's an opportunity for us to express gratitude as a very important aspect of Dana. It's an opportunity to say thank you for what we feel we've benefited from by returning that generosity with generous appreciation. And the 6 ways that the Buddha set out that we could express generosity by giving are, and I have another slide for these, if we could have that one up, thank you. And there we go. So there are these ways of giving. I've changed the language a little bit to make them more appropriate to our times. But the Buddha said that we can give material things, we can give time and energy, we can give skills and knowledge, we can give fearlessness. It's an interesting one. We can give life and limb, and we can give the Dharma. So I'm just going to briefly go through these in the time that I have left and say a little bit about them all, just to give you some idea of the scope of this particular precept and of what open-handed generosity can really mean. And in a way, I think these things are sequential. The Buddha started with perhaps the easiest of things to give and ended with the most significant. So we'll go through them, and in a way they are in ascending order, if you like. So we start with material things. So yeah, we can give material things if we have, and generally most of us have more material things than we need. Money is an example, obviously, of material things. We may feel that we don't have enough, and I know some people don't have sufficient, but most of us have enough money to get by on. You know, we live in comfortable homes, we're well fed, we live in an affluent society. We may compare ourselves to the rich people in the next street who live in bigger, better houses, but actually, if we compare ourselves to a great majority of the Earth's population, we are well off. So we have material things that we could give. It's really having a sense of proportion about what our own needs are. And very often, material things are the only things we can give. If, for example, when we hear of a natural disaster on the other side of the world, we may feel an urge to jump on an aeroplane and fly out there and help people who are so clearly suffering. It's unlikely that that would be very helpful unless we have specific skills that we can offer. More likely we just get in the way and make the problem even worse. But what we can do is that we can donate money to those people who do have the skills and expertise to alleviate that suffering. For example, even here in our own country, you know, there are people who don't have enough food to eat, so we can donate to food banks and things like that. We can give money to charities that help the homeless. It might be a bit impractical to suggest that we go out and offer a homeless person our spare bedroom for the night, although I do know some people do that. But that may be a step too far for us, but we can give materially to charities that do offer those services to people in need. So there's a very important part there. The giving of material things is a significant aspect of expressing our generosity, but it's really just the beginning of the process. And for those of us who don't have much in the way of material possessions, well, there are other ways that we can express generosity. Time and energy is one. You know, very, very often we seem to have not much time to give, but we do have material things to give, or we don't have much in the way of material possessions, but we do have time, we do have energy, and we can give some of that. Volunteering is a typical way of giving of our time and energy, just helping others out. And again, at this particular time, you know, this whilst we're dealing with this pandemic, these things have come very much to the forefront, haven't they? It's been made very clear how we can give. There are so many ways we can give, from a local self-help group, perhaps just in your street, to a nationally organised team of volunteers helping the NHS. There are many opportunities for giving of time and energy. And those opportunities are there also outside of situations like this. When we eventually get through this pandemic, there will still be opportunity to give of our time and energy. We can also give of our skills and knowledge. It seems in our society, the general pattern is that we acquire knowledge, we gain qualifications, we learn skills, and then we use those to maximize our own personal income. We use those to make our life as comfortable as possible. But very often we could have skills and we could have knowledge that could be of use to other people who couldn't afford to pay a professional for their skills and knowledge, but they could be helped by someone volunteering to assist with their particular skill and knowledge. So it's a very important way that we can contribute, that we can express generosity by sharing what we've learned, what we've acquired in the way of skills and knowledge over our lifetime. The next item is fearlessness, a rather strange looking one. What do we mean by giving fearlessness? And I think this one's very much about the environment that we create around us, the atmosphere that we create, how we make people feel when they're in our company. You know, do people feel that they're treading on eggshells when they're around us because they never know when we're going to explode into a fit of temper, when something's going to set us off, when the most trivial of things will send us into a rage? That's certainly not creating an atmosphere of fearlessness, is it? That's completely the opposite. It's putting people in fear of being in our company. But if our behavior is generally one of kindness, affection, consideration, patience, forbearance, gentleness, then we create a very comfortable atmosphere, an atmosphere in which people feel they can be themselves, they can relax. And so we create an atmosphere of fearlessness around us. And again, in this particular environment that we're in at the moment, you know, we can create an atmosphere of anxiety around us. You know, we can report all of the most outlandish stories that go around social media. We can pass them on with our own little additions to them as ways of expressing how terrible everything is, and you know, sharing our conspiracy theories and so on and so forth, and just adding to a sense of general anxiety amongst people that come into contact with us. Or we can demonstrate a calm acceptance of the situation as it is, an assurance that things will change, that this is as impermanent as everything else, and that working together we will do our best to get through it, and that those who really need, those who are really suffering, will be taken care of. We can do what we can to see that that comes about, and so we create a calmer, gentler, more peaceful atmosphere around us, even in difficult situations like this. The fifth item on the Buddha's list of 6 ways to give was life and limb. Now, this may seem a bit extreme, and in times past when I've talked on this one has always felt a little bit abstract, because generally we're not called upon to give life and limb. But right now, of course, we know of people who are doing exactly that. People who are giving their lives for the benefit of others. I believe the figures are somewhat over 100 healthcare workers have died looking after patients with coronavirus. You know, there are people right now, possibly even people that we know, who are putting their lives on the line every day to help others. We have Sangha members who work in the health profession, and they freely give in this way, knowing that they are potentially putting their lives on the line. So yeah, it's not an abstract concept. Even in 21st century Western civilization, we can be called upon at times to give of our life and limb for the benefit of other people. And the final one on the list is giving of the Dharma. And the Buddha put this one at the top. He felt that this was the most significant thing that we can give. Because, of course, it is the Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, that can totally transform our lives. And if we can give the Dharma to someone, if we can introduce them to the Dharma, the effect that it can have on their lives could be of far more value than anything else that we can give. It is the most significant thing. But it's not, giving the Dharma is not just for people who sit at the front of classes and give talks. It's not just for people who wear a kesa, who are older members. Giving the Dharma is something that we can all give, each and every one of us, because the most effective way of giving the Dharma is through the way that we exemplify the Dharma in our lives. And when other people see a positive change in us because of our practicing the Dharma, then we are giving them the gift of the Dharma. They see the effect that it can have, and that can introduce them to the Dharma, and so they can replicate that effect in their own lives. Our example of how we live the Dharma life is, to my thinking, more important than even the most eloquent of Dharma talks. And that, I think, is an appropriate point for me to stop. So I hope from this you've begun to get a little bit of an understanding of the depth and the implications of this second precept. And we're shortly going to break up into discussion groups. And we have a couple of questions here for the discussion groups, which are about to pop up on your screen. So just a few questions that you might like to consider. You don't have to, but how do you feel when you know that you've acted with generosity? How do you feel when someone is generous to you? And then a little practical one. What do you think you could do in the coming week to express your sense of generosity more effectively? So I'm going to hand you over now to Matt, who I believe is going to send us all to our respective groups, and see you back here just before 12:30.